Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all this Monday morning to our regularly scheduled meeting of the Dorado Irrigation District for August 14th, 2023. And please join me, well, hang on a second. Call to order, roll call, please, Jen. I get ahead of myself.
Directors Osborne, Dwyer, Veerkamp, and Zini and Day present. General Manager Abercrombie, General Counsel Polson, and Clerk to the Board Sullivan present.
All right, very good. Please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by a moment of silence. And I'll say why here in a minute. Ready? Salute. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Obviously, we have a serious situation in Maui that has occurred. Also, a helicopter crash in Southern California that killed 3 firefighters, George, I believe.
Okay, I found this on the web.
Sorry. And Pat Dwyer's phone. We need a moment of silence for that, Pat. All right, so thank you for that. And we will now go to our adoption of agenda. Do we have a motion for approval?
I'll move approval.
Second.
Okay, any comments, questions? Any public input in the room? Any public input online, Jen?
If members of the board would like to address the public, if members of the public would like to address the board at any public comment period during this meeting, please refer to the detailed instructions on page 2 of today's agenda. President Veerkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the, public wishing to comment on the adoption of today's agenda, moved by Director Anzini and seconded by Director Osborne.
All right, please vote.
Oops, wait a minute. Can you reset it, please? I hit the wrong button. Thank you.
We're voting one more time
Okay,
for
on
the
the adoption
adoption of today's agenda.
Please vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
All right, so we'll move on to communications. General Manager, employee recognition.
Good morning. I have one recognition and I'll have a comment under the general manager's report later. The district received a call from a customer named Jim Fleming to express his thanks for Don Holland, distribution operator, and Gene Hayden, another distribution operator, who worked on a repair near his home. He stated that from start to finish, they were easy to work with and very professional. Again, it's part of the excellence we try to achieve when we're serving our customers. That concludes the recognition portion.
All right, thank you very much. Wanting to move on to public comment. Do we have any public comment in the room? That's not on the agenda. Anybody online, Jen?
It does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on our open public comment period.
All right, we'll move on to communications. General Manager.
Good morning. I'm pleased and saddened today. Tim Ranstrom announced his retirement from the district September 8th after being here since February 23 of 2009. He was here a little bit before me. We're going to miss him, but he's moving on literally to, I'm not sure I'd call Texas greener pastures, but a long way from here, so we'll miss him. But I'm also very pleased to introduce Aaron Kennedy, our new IT director. Aaron, come on up and maybe just say a word or two. He comes from us, yeah, that's fine, from Bakersfield.
Oh, good old Kern County.
Members of the board, pleasure to begin working with you as Tim's replacement, and hopefully I'm able to accomplish as much as he has to continue the excellent customer service that you're used to. And again, as Jim mentioned, I am from the I actually live in the city of Shafter, just north of Bakersfield, but have worked for the city of Bakersfield up until Friday, about 16 years, serving as their assistant director for their technology services department. If you have any questions or
No, welcome.
Welcome.
Yep.
Welcome. Highly rated and great feedback.
In my
from
younger
customers.
days, I was a official CAL FIRE liaison to Kern County, and I spent a lot of time in Lake Isabella and the west, and you're coming to God's country from Bakersfield.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, from the flatlands up in here to the hills, and it's quite beautiful up in this area.
I just have to say, Tim, congratulations on your retirement. Thank you for all you've done. You just had one failure, and that's sitting next to me here, George. And so, Aaron, your new job, number one, is teach George how to use
I'm an
his
IT expert.
devices.
You beat me to it. I was gonna.
George uses his IT devices quite effectively. He uses them a lot. He used them over the weekend.
Yeah, I did really good.
It's been a pleasure working with all of you, serving you all, and it's been a highlight of my very long career. Look forward to the next chapters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Y'all come back.
Yeah, you come back with a draw.
We've
Anything?
got a lot to cover, so we're going to step out if that's
All right.
okay.
Yep. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Clerk of the Board, Jen, do you have anything to report?
Nothing today, thank you.
All right, Board of Directors.
I just, a comment. I've been really distraught this week over those 3 firefighters that went down in a helicopter. I crashed in a helicopter once, and I'm telling you, you are powerless. When that fan quits turning, you're going down. And fortunately, I was only 50 feet off the ground, but I hit and got off. But these guys were about 2,000 feet, and they lost 2 rotors out of 4, and down they went. And I've been bummed all week.
Thank you, George. Pat?
Yes, on a brighter note, our maintenance crews, EID maintenance crews, have been working on the fire hydrants in the Logtown area and doing a great job, getting a lot of positive feedback. People are really happy to see those tested and all bright and shiny, so thanks to the team.
Thank you, Pat. Anything, Alan or Lori? Just a couple brief things. LAFCO is dark for August and now September as well. We're waiting on some MSR updates, and we don't have them yet. I'd like to really thank council for the exemplary work that was done on that Mortera Circle water line issue, so thank Brian and your staff as well. And then Friday, I got to attend the Western Caucasus Foundation's Policy Forum in Yosemite. Bad place to go. Supervisor Turnbull was a witness relative to the Caldor fire. And then they also had a water forum in the afternoon put on by Congressman McClintock and a couple of others that was interesting on Hetch Hetchy and the whole water delivery system of Hetch Hetchy. So that was an unexpected pleasure that came up last minute last week, and I attended that with, again, Supervisor Turnbull. It was the first time they did a congressional field hearing in the history of the country, outside of Washington, D.C. Maybe it'll mean something, I don't know. Anyway, it was good, very good. All right, so we will move on from there and attempt to approve our consent calendar. Do we have a motion?
I'll move to approve.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Do we have a second?
Second.
Director Osborne, thank you. Any comments or questions relative to it? Any public input in the audience? Seeing none, we will now go to,
If members of the public would like to address the board on the approval of today's consent calendar, moved by Director Dwyer and second by Director Osborne, this is the time. President Veerkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on the approval of today's consent calendar. I believe we're ready for the vote.
all right, please vote on the consent calendar.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
All right, we will move into our workshop items. Finance. Good morning.
Okay. Good morning, President Veerkamp, Board Directors. I'm Jamie Bandy, Finance Director. We are here today for our second in a number of workshops related to our water and wastewater revenue study. Just some quick previous board action. In February of this year, the board did award a contract to NBS Government Finance Group to conduct the cost of service analysis. In June of this year, board participated in our first workshop for that cost of service study. Let's see, the summary of issue. Today, we are here, again, because we are preparing a comprehensive update to our cost of service analysis. Today's workshop includes an overview of the methodology that is being used, our policy considerations, and the proposed financial plans as we evaluate the revenue increases that are required to meet the service costs. So again, the cost of service analysis is a process of developing rates that meet but do not exceed our costs required to provide services. Proposition 218 does have regulations that we are required to follow. The workshop that we held in June elicited board and public discussion regarding our policy objectives, our rate structures, reserve and coverage ratio policies, as well as priorities when we're developing these proposed rate increases. At that board meeting, we also discussed, the board discussed and agreed that the study and the financial plan should balance three priorities: affordability, infrastructure reliability, and rate stability. So incorporating feedback from that workshop, staff and our consultants worked together to develop the financial plans that will be presented here today. Some background information before we move into the financial plans. It's not on the slides. In December of '22, we did present our operating budget as well as our 5-year financial forecast. At that time, the forecast proposed an 8% revenue increase to drinking water and recycled water rates in order to meet our revenue requirements. Again, needed to meet the district's annual operating and maintenance costs, as well as our debt service requirements. Also, that financial plan included a last-minute reduction in our 5-year CIP of over $20 million, as well as reduction in our plans for tank maintenance, mainly to maintain our minimal end-of-year cash amounts. Since then, inflation has continued to increase, along with the need for increasing capital expenditures. Our past financial plans also included rates that were adequate to generate, on average, about $10 to $12 million to fund our smaller construction projects on a pay-as-you-go basis. With the increased operations and maintenance costs, construction costs and inflation have continued to rise, and our current pay-as-you-go annual revenue has decreased to only about $2 to $4 million. So the financial models that we're going to be presenting today reflect higher cost assumptions and proposed revenue increases than those that were presented in December. To give a quick overview of what you'll be seeing today, the financial plans presented today identifies the necessity for a 12% annual revenue increase for both our drinking water and recycled water throughout the 5 years, as well as a 3% revenue increase for our wastewater. Again, the revenue increases are necessary to meet our operating expenses, to fund our financial reserves, meet our bond coverage requirements, and pay the annual debt service on our outstanding debts. Staff also developed a financial plan alternative with a 9% revenue increase for water and wastewater, for water and recycled water, for comparison to try to keep that proposed revenue requirement to a single-digit increase. I do want to point out, however, that the 12% and 3% increases, the district, with the 12% and 3% increases, the district does meet the reserve requirements identified in our administrative regulations in all years of the 5-year plan. It increases our days of cash on hand to 190 days, and it does fund the proposed CIP expenditures. Conversely, the district does not meet its reserve targets with the 9% increase option in most of the years. If the same rate funded, capital expenses are included compared with the 12% alternative. Additionally, over the 5-year period, the days of cash on hand dip as low as 79 days. So from 190, it does dip down to 79. Our capital expenditures will require reductions. And what that would equate to is fewer service line replacements, pipeline replacements, as well as our storage tank recoatings, which obviously will just further challenge our already aging assets. So just to kind of recap today, what we are looking at today are the revenue requirements that are needed to meet the district's service costs. Any feedback that is received from today's discussion will then guide our next steps in the rate design. So Jeremy Tamargo from NBS and Sanjay Gar from Water Resources Economics are here with us today. And at this time, I'd like to invite Jeremy up to the podium to discuss in more detail the proposed financial plans. There you go.
Thank you, Jamie. Good morning, members of the board. I'm Jeremy Tamargo. I'm here from MBS. I'm pinch hitting for Greg Klumpner this morning, so I appreciate you all having me today. I always joke with Greg, I don't have quite as many gray hairs as him, but I'm working on it, so.
What's hair? I've heard about it.
That's true, too. I try to keep it short to hide the grays. My 5-year-old is always kind of poking fun at me about that, so. Anyway, so I'm going to start the presentation, kind of give an overview of the methodology, the draft financial plans, and then I'll turn it over to my teammate Sanjay here to talk about some of the rate simplification topics that have been discussed. Next slide, please. So just the biggest picture, right, zooming all the way out, is that there are 3 components of a comprehensive rate study, right? So there's the financial plan, which we talk about the revenue requirements. The second piece is that cost of service analysis, where we allocate the revenue requirements to the customer classes. And then the third is when we actually get into the rate design, right, and design that structure to meet the district's need. Today's focus is on piece number 1, really zooming in on the draft revenue requirements and those financial plans that we put together for both water as well as the wastewater system. Okay, so let's talk about kind of overview of the policy considerations when we're developing these financial plans. So throughout the presentation this morning, the 2 things that we really want to keep in mind, right, when we're talking about these revenue requirements and the revenue increases that we're looking at, there's the 2 policies that are going to determine the financial health of the district. One is your reserves, right? So we need reserves in order to meet our cash flow requirements and to mitigate risks, right? So your reserve is directly proportional, right, to the financial health of the district. The second piece is what's called the coverage ratio. So that's the ratio of your revenues that exceed your operating expenses, so revenues minus expenses, compared to what your debt service obligations are. And the higher the ratio, the better the credit rating. The current rating is an A+ with Moody's here at the district, and as far as I know, that A+ is pretty good, right? And so that's very important, especially when we're thinking about new debt issuance in 24 and 27, to maintain that high credit rating with Moody's as we look to issue new debt. Thank you. So I believe Greg has talked about this in the previous workshop, but just to give a brief summary, there's a number of different reserves specific to the utility systems, right? So there's the operating reserve, which deals with your O&M budget. Goal for the minimum is 3 months of your operating expenses. two different capital reserves. So the capital replacement reserve helps with the funding of those capital expenditures, where we also have the routine capital replacement. So that's fleet, equipment, kind of those smaller needs during the course of the year. And then we also have a couple of smaller reserves, the self-insurance reserve and the unfunded accrued pension liability reserve. So all of these pieces go into the requirements in terms of the cash on hand for the district. And then the second piece, so reserves is the one big piece, and then the second piece that we really want to focus on, again, when we're talking about the financial plan, are your coverage ratio requirements. So a minimum of 1.25 debt coverage ratio without the FCCs, those facility capacity charges, preferably 1.5, and then maintain 1.7 to 2.0 is the goal with the FCC revenue included. And I know this is a bit of a scary math slide here, but basically what we're saying is, right, so you take your revenues, so both from rates as well as non-rates, and then you add the revenue from your rate increases over the 5-year period, subtract out your operating expenses, so that's your net revenue, right? What's the revenue resulting after you take out those expenses? And what we're really interested in is that senior debt service coverage. So once you've calculated that net revenue, you're going to divide that by your water and your sewer debt service, but you subtract out that pension fund bond since that is not yet senior debt. And the kind of unique thing about how this is structured for the coverage ratio is we're combining two utilities. So the water and the sewer utility data is all together in calculating that debt service ratio. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the draft financial plans. I'm going to start with the water utility and then move into wastewater. So biggest picture again, financial plan, we're talking about what are the costs that we need to recover from our customer rates. And the term we use for this is the net revenue requirements. So the costs we want to take into account, so your O&M budget, your debt service, your pay-as-you-go capital projects, and then your contribution to the reserve funds. And so that net revenue requirement that we talked about, so we take our O&M costs, the debt service, and the capital expenses, and then we subtract out the non-rate revenues that are coming in order to determine what that net revenue requirement would be on an annual basis. And so we have two alternatives here to look at in terms of the water utility and the one recommendation for wastewater. So I want to point out that NBS, the project team in collaboration with district staff, we've looked at a number of different financial plan alternatives, right? And this is really the distillation of kind of all of those scenarios that we're presenting today. The two different water alternatives that we want to look at, one is a 9% annual increase in the revenue requirements. And again, I know it says rate increases up there, but really what we're talking about today is revenue requirements, right? And then in the subsequent steps, 2 and 3, right, is when we really get into that cost of service and allocate to the different customer classes. So the 9% increase is looking at 75% of the CIP, and you could see one of the targets we're looking at is that ending reserve balance, right? So with the 9%, essentially this draft alternative is looking to get right to the minimum, essentially, at the end of that 5-year period in terms of your reserve targets. Whereas the 12%, the one that is recommended this morning, also only funding the 75% of the CIP, so not the full CIP, but you could see that ending reserve target is much healthier. One thing I do want to point out is that the rate-funded CIP projects for that 9% option is actually less than the full amount in the 12% option. So we had decreased it from 27 million down to the 21 million in order basically to make this fit, right? And so the idea with the 9% increase is to get basically right to that minimum reserve target at the end of the 5-year period.
Director
Yes.
Yeah, talking about alternatives, you know, it looks like it was determined this is how much we want to spend. Were alternatives looked at where maybe spending was 10% less, 5% less? Did we look at less spending alternatives?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of iteration with the district staff in terms of what the assumptions that go into coming up with this recommended.
I would propose that would be useful for the board to see those sort of alternatives as well.
For the expenditure side, we did not go in and try and reduce the operating expenses because the forecast is they're going to go higher by at least 5% on an annualized basis, as opposed to the December financial plan showed it down to 2%. I don't think it makes a lot of,
I was talking
Sense to-
more about CIP spending, Jim.
oh, thank you. We did cut CIP spending. If you look at that parentheses, 75% CIP, and then at the quotes, 100% for the 4 bonded projects. Assuming that we go with those 4 bonded projects, it's 100%. And then anything left, it's actually about 57% of the remaining CIP is all that's funded. So we cut deeply into that. And it's not a good long-term solution because this is only the 5-year plan. We're also looking at a 10-year plan. We didn't present it today just because it's the rate studies for 5 years. But in 29, 30, and 31, there's significant capital expenditures coming as well. Primarily, and Brian will be talking about this shortly, water treatment plant expenses. The board was briefed on replacing the 3 pumps down in El Dorado Hills because they're failed. We had 2 failures of the filtration filters down at, or the clarifiers down in El Dorado Hills water treatment plant. And the next board meeting, Brian Mueller will present to the board a draft of what is needed to rehab some of our aging water treatment plants. I can't remember I wasn't here, of course, but I think that plant down in El Dorado Hills, looking Brian Mueller, probably 1960 vintage. So, you know, it's 1960 vintage, 60 years old. We haven't made a lot of capital replacements on that. So part of it's my fault because we haven't shared that Corolla report with you. It's going to be at the next board meeting, but we're forecasting at least $200 million after this 5-year period, focusing on water treatment plants. We're trying to delay some of that until the debt service drops off in 2036, but some of these will need to be taken up and fixed because we're operating on margins. Those 2 clarifiers, thank God, they were fixed before the peak season, which our staff was just remarkable at getting them fixed and all that. But it would be very challenging to produce enough water during the peak season if they weren't fixed. So from the capital side, we've made significant reductions, and I hope it's not too much.
Continue.
Thank you, Jim. And as Jim was alluding to, this is really kind of a distillation of all the different alternatives that we've looked at and acknowledging that there's significant capital expenses currently underway and coming in the future, right? Part of the goal of the rate study and the financial plan is to mitigate those future rate shocks, right? So if we did something less, right, even currently what we have with the 8%, right, forecasting that that's not going to be enough if we project out into the future, right, we're going to run into even higher rate increases, right, as you kind of defer the needed maintenance from the capital side of things. So I'll get into some more details in the subsequent slides of the two different alternatives that we're presenting here for water. So thank you. I know this chart's a bit overwhelming here, so I have some subsequent graphics as well here. But really, the big things to highlight are those gray and then the green columns there, right? So you're talking about, right, before your rate increase, right? So at currently budget, we're okay, but as you look into the out years, right, you could see that you're running some significant deficits, right? By 28, you're looking at, you're in the whole 22 million, right, in terms of that difference between the use of funds and the sources of funds, right? So this 9% is basically we're trying to just keep pace, right, with the revenue requirements. Next slide, please. So I like the graphics a lot better to illustrate the. We could certainly come back to those tables if we want to, but this 9%, right? The dotted line is showing that the goal here of this draft alternative is really just to keep pace, right, with those expenses. That solid black line is if we had stayed flat, right? And you could see, especially by those outer years, we're not keeping pace with the expenses in terms of the capital, the debt service, and those increasing O&M expenses over the 5-year period. So again, one of the big things, right, reserve fund coverage ratio here. So basically this option was really tailored to try to just get us to that minimum target by the end of the 5-year period. And you could see actually in 27, it dips slightly below the minimum during that year, but we're basically just ending up in 28 right at what that recommended minimum target would be for both the operating reserve and the capital R&R reserve there. And I like the graphics better than the tape. I'll just, so this illustrates, right? So the blue line or the blue bars are your ending cash balance, whereas your green line, right, is that minimum target reserve, right? And so we're tracking just along those minimum targets, which is actually far below that 70 million target cash that's in AR 3012. Jim, did you have any more comments on this particular, the 9%?
Just to put that 70 million perspective, operating cash reserve should be in the 14-15 million range. Capital replacement reserves for prior year depreciations, 24 million. Routine capital replacement reserve, 24 million. And then funding the district's exposure to insurance deductibles. It shows 1 million, but given some of the insurance issues, probably should be around 5 million. And that brings us to about $65-70 million for the minimum reserves that is part of that AR, and I think it's 3012. So, but I'll have more comments after this with the 9 and the 12.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Jim. So this is the same group of slides here, but this is showing the 12% revenue increase. And again, same situation, the 75% CIP option. Just a few things to highlight on this option is that actually over the 5-year period with the 12% increase, we're showing a higher level of rate-funded capital expenses being able to be funded out of the rates. So like I said, we're showing 27 million for rate-funded capital expenses in this plan compared to the 9% option. We had to ramp that down to 21 million in the 9% to meet those minimum reserve targets. I'll go to the next slide here because I think this graph shows the picture, right? And so again, the black line is if we stayed with the existing rates, we're going to be outstripping the revenues, right, in terms of those projected expenses. So here, the revenue increases, we're not only keeping pace, but we're actually starting to build that reserve again. And in talking with Jim and district staff, that's a key, really thinking about all of the capital projects, the wastewater treatment plant improvements that are going to be required in those out years in the study. And so that is part of the reason for this 12% as the recommendation, really to start to build on that reserve fund, not just maintain it right at the exact minimum levels.
Comment, can you go back to that chart,
Oh, yeah,
please?
sure.
Just an observation, you know, as a board and as management decision makers, there's not a lot we can mess around with. The blue bars there are operating budget, and that's pretty much fixed. There's not a lot of decisions we can make that'll change that significantly, and it keeps edging up with inflation. The red bars are all our debt service, and a similar comment is there's not much we can really do about the debt service, so it's fixed. The only part that we can mess with, for the lack of a better term, is the green bars, which is our capital expenditure. And those we'll discuss, but they're necessary to keep the infrastructure up and running. And we just need to be very careful about what we choose to do. But that's our decision area, is just in the capital. And we don't have a lot of wiggle room there.
Yeah, it's a great point, Pat. And with the increased cost of capital year after year, you pay me now or pay me a whole lot later. Director Osborne?
I was gonna bring this up later, but not too many years ago, the bond rating for this agency was C plus B minus. And that's when I first got here, which has been eons ago. But at any rate, now with A plus or A minus, can you off the top of your head tell us what the difference would be in a 30-year bond in rate? What I'm asking you something that's just off the top of your head, but I would guess it's 2 or 3%. Is that calculates it a huge amount of money over a period of time?
So I'm not an MA, but I know Jamie's here. I don't want to put you on the spot here. But I know there are significant cost savings, right, in terms of that. So I don't want you to quote me on, the
Okay,
exact
that's right.
number, but I know A plus is better than C, B minus or
Yeah.
whatever that, right? So,
Yeah.
yes, like, and in talking with Jim and Jamie, right, part of the coverage requirement conversation is very important, right? Especially talking about those future debt service issuances that we'll be getting into.
While I said we didn't have much discretion in discussing or making changes to the operating costs or the debt service costs, we can't reduce those, but we certainly can increase them. And by having a lower bond rating, that red bar gets taller.
Sure.
So we need to be very, very careful about that.
Yeah, Director Day?
Yeah, just a question, and going through all this, and correct me, I may have misread it, because we're talking about revenue, need for revenue. It looked like for future water sales that we were keeping that flat, and are we not anticipating new homes coming online, or did I misread that?
Yeah, I'll let Jim.
Yeah, I believe it's, and I'm looking at Jamie, I think it's like a 0.5% increase each year for that. So yeah, but 0.5% isn't, gonna make or break us, but we did forecast increased water usage, and that's in that
Okay.
forecast range.
And Jim, would that be on the same with FCCs? Because obviously those new homes are.
Great question on that. We used to plan on like 10 million a year on FCCs. My direction to staff was to reduce that over time, because you don't know about the economy, you don't know about the rates for home purchasing. So that has been reduced over time. I remember a very unpleasant experience when we used to get $13 million of FCC revenues and it dropped to 1 million the next year, and we were in, 18 and 10% rate increases, and I don't ever want to go back there, and I don't think this board does too. So we may be conservative on the FCCs, but really FCCs should help with the capital construction, not fully funded. So that has been forecast going down.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
Bless you.
So this is the same table again, but this is for the 12% revenue increase option. So in this scenario, we're meeting that total recommended minimum target in each of the 5 years of the study period. And really the key, that green bar, right, the ending balance is going up, right? And talking with staff, that's a key consideration considering all of the capital projects that are forecasted over the longer term, not just the 5-year period that we're looking at.
And I'll augment just a little bit on that. If you compare it to the 9% where it's just barely meeting the ending balance compared to this 12% where we have a $18 million surplus, that's geared toward future capital expenditures, not only for this 5-year period, but the 6th and 7th year. So this board doesn't put future boards in a pickle going forward. So that was why we selected the 12%. Thank you. Oh, and lastly, the comparisons too, with all the inflation and all that, we've been eating up a lot of our pay-as-you-go projects. We don't have that much pay-go projects anymore. The 12% gets us back up to about 13 million a year in pay-go projects, as opposed to 9s of around 8 million a year. So that's an important factor moving forward, so we don't have to continue to borrow.
So I'm assuming, because that's a $13 million difference from the 9% for the 12%, right? You just said 13 million in pay-go.
13 versus about 8 annually on the average.
Right, but the capital projects, as you alluded to before, and here we have a 60-year-old water treatment plant, which we're trying to piecemeal together, all that. It just makes sense to me that when it comes to our infrastructure, that the conservative part, I mean, considering the fact that after the pandemic and the costs of finding people to do our major work at the flumes, that was such a huge cost. Will we ever recoup that? And I guess my feeling is with that experience that we need to make sure those reserves are healthy, just in case.
I agree 100%.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and again, part of this was a $50 million bond issuance in 2024. That was to help with some major projects. And then there's another $100 million
These are the
bond.
planned ones, right?
Yeah, going forward. That's probably subject to how much the board wants to do, the future boards want to do on water treatment plant asset replacement.
Correct, okay, thank you.
So next topic is the wastewater financial plan. We're only presenting the one alternative here. We're looking at the 3% annual revenue increase each year of the 5-year period. So same story as with the water alternatives, right? So you're looking at the deficiency before the rate increase, right? So you could see in 24 through 28, we're looking at a deficiency. But adding in that 3% increase by the end of the 5-year period, we're operating in the blue here. So next slide. And again, the black line, right, is saying that with the current rates, right, our revenues are going to dip below what those expenses are, especially looking at the outer years. whereas the 3% is sufficient for not only meeting those expenses, but starting to build up the reserve a bit, which is the stated goal of, and speaking with staff. So that green bar there, right, the ending balance is really what we're interested in compared to that minimum target. And so we're setting on a trajectory. So not only are we meeting that absolute minimum, but we're starting to build up that reserve, especially looking at, CIP projects over the 5-year period, but especially looking longer term in terms of what those needs will be for the wastewater system. And here, we're dipping slightly below the minimum in the beginning years of the study period, but by 27, 28, that's when really we're starting to build up, and we're looking at the healthy reserve trajectory into the future. Before I get to the coverage ratio, Jim, was there anything you wanted to talk about with regards to the wastewater system?
No, we've been implementing pretty minimal rates over time. This is kind of what we've shared with the board is let's continue to have small increases over time to build up the reserves, and I think that chart reflects that.
Thank you, Jim. So we've talked a lot about the reserve fund targets, right? So the second piece of this is the coverage ratio requirements, right? Next slide, please. So this first slide, again, there's a lot on the table, but this is looking at the 9% water rate increase and the 3% sewer rate increase. Again, 75% CIP option for both of these. So the things to look at is that total net revenue, right? So you have that net revenue is going to be increasing over time with those annual revenue adjustments, right? But the key is that that is keeping pace sufficiently with the debt service, right? So we could see as we're looking at the total senior debt service is really what we want to be looking at. And you could see how that's increasing over time during the study period, right? And that's because of the outstanding debt as well as the new debt that is projected to be issued over the study period. And so the target, right, that debt service, it starts at 2, it's kind of 1.5, right? By the end of the study period, we're at 1.65. So not bad, but basically this was just kind of meeting those minimum targets. Whereas if we flip to the next one, this is the exact same graph, but one more back, thank you. The exact same table, but really looking at that senior debt service coverage, you could see how much healthier it is over the study period, right? Only dipping below 2 in that 1 year, and we're finishing at 2.0 or 2.01 by the end of the study period. And really, this is another focus when we're talking about the water rate increases, particularly, right, deciding between the 9% and the 12%. Especially thinking about those future debt service issuances, right? That we want the coverage ratio as high as we can, right? Not just hitting those minimums in order to realize those savings, right? With the issuances as with those interest rates. So.
And just add, when we do the key performance indicators presentation before the board, I always like to highlight that Moody's recommends about a 2.4 coverage for best or for medium agencies such as EID for fiscal responsibility and fiscal, I guess, goals moving forward. We don't hit that, come close a couple years, but certainly the 12% option is the better option.
So at this point, we'll have time for questions at the end, certainly, but I'm going to turn it over to my teammate Sanjay here. He's going to talk about some of the rate simplification options as well as talk about the schedule as we move forward. So I'll sit down for a minute here.
Thank you, Jeremy. President, board members, staff, it's my pleasure to be here again to speak with you. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the financial plan. Jeremy did a great job about that, talking about how much revenue we need to collect on an annual basis to make sure we meet our reserve and our coverage ratio requirements. And the next step of the process, as Jeremy mentioned, is the cost of service and rate design. And that's where we really start allocating costs. We understand the business model of EID. We understand what rate structure makes sense. We went through a pricing objective with you, which you provided us great guidelines about how to design rates and meet the needs of our community. Based on that, what we're recommending is that single family and ag and small with resident be combined. And we'll have a rate structure with that. The ag small farms with resident will take into account both the domestic needs and the irrigation needs for agriculture. So we'll make sure we address those things. But the meters charge will be the same, as we're specifically talking about, base charge. The second one is multifamily, commercial, landscape, and recreational turf. Those three, again, those meter charges will be the same. So everyone will pay the same charge, for instance, for a 1 inch, a 5/8, a 3/4 inch. We'll keep ag without residential and raw water metered separate because of the nature of that characteristic. They don't need treated water. So we'll take into account that factor. Recycled water, that base charge will be the same. So that, as you recall, there's two charges you have. You have a base charge, which is the fixed charge, and then you have a commodity charge. So we talked about the base charge. Now we're going to be talking about the commodity. The commodity, we're recommending we maintain the tiered rate structure that you have. We may change the tier width, so we're going to be looking at the tier width. Yes, please.
Yeah, while combining on base charges is a mild simplification, it still leaves the myriad commodity charges, which is where it gets complicated and the charts get confusing. Why not, in the commodity charges, for instance, combine multifamily, commercial, and rec turf? They're all very similar, higher volume users.
Okay, we can definitely look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the goals is to simplify those charts, and they're all very similar type users. There's really no reason to have three sets of tiered charges.
Certainly we can look at that. I believe the residential is the three-tiered system, and I don't have the rate sheet in front of me, maybe Jamie has it, but the others are just an average rate, just one rate. So what that could do is impact the low water user much more significantly than the high water user for residential customers. The board in the past wanted to have that three-tiered structure for residential.
Yeah, no, but I was looking in particular at the multifamily, commercial, and rec turf. But that does bring me up to my next question, and Sanjay, maybe we were going to get to it, of the commodity charges. What's the rationale for doing just that, of making a median rate for recycled water?
Well, right now, recycled water is very complicated. You have a tiered rate structure. You have different rates for different customer classes. It's all recycled water. It's all for outdoor irrigation. So the thought process is let's simplify that and let's use a uniform rate structure, taking into account that there are time periods where recycled water needs potable water. So we'll take that average weight and we'll look at how much recycled water is produced, how much potable water is needed as supplemental, and we'll make sure that rate structure reflects that.
So there is still intention to review that, if that's going to be at phase 2,
Yes.
looking at that.
And the other thought is that the recycled water rate is significantly lower than the potable water rate, so the median rate for recycled water wouldn't be as impactful. And it's only used, 5 months out of the year as opposed to year-round, but we'd certainly take direction from the board.
Well, I would just be curious too, because one of the reasons we have tiered rates in potable water for residential is theoretically to encourage conservation. It's not because it costs us more when they use more water. It doesn't. I would be a concern or a question, I guess, would be better if we do a single rate for recycle and they did not conserve as much the recycled water people, as potable did in the last two droughts. Are we not setting ourselves up to encourage more water use at the very, and then we have to supplement with potable? So those are just all questions
Correct.
going
And
through my head.
it's definitely a balancing act here about how do we get to that right spot? Because technically with, or the challenge with recycled water is that you could have the same meter size, but they're both irrigating a very large different area. And so if we did a tiered rate structure, the one that happens to be irrigating a little bit more will be penalized more, even though they need to irrigate more because it's a bigger park than a smaller park, but they both have the same meter size. So in order to solve that challenge, we would have to have the irrigation area, and then you create what we call a water budget, which is more complicated and more administrative cost. So, it's that balancing act of what's equitable, administrative ease, and information, and what makes sense. So for us, we feel like this medium rate structure, it's that balance. It hits the right spot, but definitely we're looking for direction from the board.
I would just say that there's the risk that that they use more water, and we have to supplement with potable more, which costs us more.
Correct.
So I would just say, consider that, and when we were looking at the cost assignments, that it may be actually more potable being used, not the same or less.
Correct. So that's the next step, is to understand what is that cost of the potable water. Your system is slightly different than other areas in California because you're not buying like imported water, which is very expensive. You have your own water here. So it is not as expensive as other communities that deal with this challenge. But still, we need to understand what that cost is, so we'll do that.
Director Osborne, I believe, has a comment.
Yeah, I just want clarification on a single-family ag. Under the current system, a few years ago, we said that if you have a residence on your ag, you pay the first two tiers as a residential rate, and then the third tier goes to the ag rate. Is that still
Correct.
what you're talking about here?
Yes. It's just,
Okay.
the only thing different now is that the meter charge, right now there's different charges for that meter charge.
Right.
And we want to keep it all the same just for simplification. But we'll still have that,
Two-tier,
correct.
okay,
So
then,
that it reflects that the higher water use is used for irrigation, for agricultural use.
the ag kicks in the third tier.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Director Dwyer?
Yes, an observation, last time we did the study, the board decided to split 50/50 with the base charge and the commodity charge. By increasing the base charge as your recommendation, either 9 or 12%, and leaving the commodity charge as it is, isn't that going to change that ratio?
Yeah, sorry for the confusion. So we haven't yet determined how much of the base and commodity we're looking at of that split of revenue. Most likely, we'll definitely look at 50/50. That's the first cut. And then we may want to look at increasing that slightly. Again, it's a balancing act because as we increase that fixed charge, one of the challenges is affordability, especially for low-end water users. And how do we make sure we maintain affordability? And so but we want revenue stability, right? So that there's this sort of, again, a balancing act here, and how do we get to that sweet spot?
And just to be clear, the commodity change under where it says water, leave as is, it doesn't mean that the future revenue requirements won't be applied to the commodity side. It's just the structure of how we calculate the water rates.
All right, continue.
Yes. So next slide, please. So that's the discussion of that. Now we're going to go into schedule. So we're going to get your feedback today, incorporate all your comments, potentially with rate design and financial plan. We'll be continuing our analysis of the cost of service for water, wastewater, and recycle, and then we'll be presenting that to you, the final rates and the whole package with the revenue requirements, cost of service, and rates. This is the schedule that we've talked about before. We started the study, as you remember, March and June. Cost of service analysis is being conducted, rate design, April and August. We will like to have the public meetings and workshops. We're starting that off in August and September. The Prop 218 notice would be in September, public hearing October and November. And then we go into the operating budget workshop on October 23rd and the operating budget adoption November 14th. Is there any questions you have for me or for Jeremy or for staff?
Just a comment. I'm doing a little construction project at home. 4 years ago, I bought siding for $42 a sheet. I just bought 5 sheets, $122 a sheet. And I read an article by a guy that was building subdivisions, and he said with the cost of materials and his labor and a reasonable profit, he can't even sell property anymore. It's just gotten, the material costs have just gone skyrocketed. And I used to buy a elbow, or a 3/4 inch elbow for 29 cents, 89 cents, it's just crazy. But it is what it is, and so we have to live with it. I mean, whether we like it or not, the material costs and construction costs have just gone nuts.
Okay, Director Dwyer?
Thank you. Couple of comments. I think these are not easy decisions. It's our fiduciary responsibility to keep the organization in good financial health. And as tough as some of these decisions are, we need to do the right thing. On the other hand, we have to seriously look at the impact on our ratepayers and what's that going to do to people, that some of whom are on fixed incomes, and here we're proposing 12%, 70-something% over the 5-year period. What's the real impact on them? So what I'd really like to see is, in our next session, is a chart that doesn't do percentages and millions and all that, is what is the impact on the average customer? And I'd like to see it for a monthly impact, a bi-monthly impact, and then what's the annual impact of that? And I think if just doing some rough calculations, it looks like, and it might lessen the blow. Again, if people will look at this board and say, oh my God, you're proposing a 12% rate increase. What are you thinking? You're going to kill us out here. And if we said that 12% is actually $8 a month on the average bill, I think that would help put things in perspective.
Great idea.
Director Day?
Yeah, to follow along with that, if expand it out to make it, because we have such diverse water use in our district, some people, that don't really irrigate much of anything because they have just natural trees and stuff around them, to you go to people with yards and large yards, families and stuff like that, like down in El Dorado Hills, Cameron Park and such. So if we could look at those charts that Director Dwyer asked, but have the low, medium, and high water users and be able to compare the impact on them.
Director Anzini?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. And I just want to piggyback on what Director Dwyer said, is it's complex and people don't understand it. And when the wrong words get into the wrong mouth, it ends up being EID board members are raising our rate 70%. You said it yourself. So, over a period of 5 years. But that's a very easy thing to say. However, people need to understand the details on how much it means at their faucet. And that means dollars. And I hopefully, we're paying you a lot of money to do this cost of living services study. The part I really want to know is the impact on the people who are on low income, who we have, how many is this going to impact, the education of people who are under a threshold that can qualify for the lower rate, and the education on this is what we provide to you. And it's got to be very simple education, 1, 2, 3. And that way it can make it easier to deliver this, because I think most of this board agrees that the capital improvement projects that we have are necessary. And I've been on other boards for other kind of agencies, this is not tax-based, this is rate-based. And so, but people don't look at that as much. The rate is how much you use at your faucet. It's not a tax base based on Board of Supervisors of the state of California, the federal government. This is your board. But the complexities is how much is it going to cost me to water my tomato plants if I'm on the controlled rate, or I have purple pipes. My simple dialogue with people, do you have purple pipes? This makes a difference in your water bill. And, it just needs to be explained very simply and understandably and very public.
Okay, Jim?
Okay, maybe just a little bit added value. So what I'm hearing is prepare this type of information with the 12% revenue requirement and the 3% revenue requirement on the annual increases. I'd like to expand the feedback to the board, not only high, medium, and low water users, but dual commodity customers, so it's water, water and wastewater, water, wastewater, and recycled customers. Because as in the past, and I don't know what the numbers are, but if you have a higher water revenue requirement and a much lower wastewater requirement, the impact to the customers that are dual commodity customers are much less. So the board, I think, would like to see all that information, and we'll be prepared to bring that back.
And again, thanks for the presentation. Great questions as well from the board.
President Veerkamp, if I could just
yes.
add one comment. Sorry, I'm a little slow here, but I just wanted to point out, one of the statements made earlier, Director Day, you mentioned that our tiers are designed such to provide a conservation incentive, and while that is true, I think you said it doesn't cost us more water to provide water at the higher tier. Sanjay indicated that unlike other agencies around the state, our water supply is ours. We don't purchase it from, say, like a metropolitan water district. There are nevertheless incremental costs associated with providing a higher volume of water during peak periods. So that tier 3 residential cost is higher, not just because it's a conservation incentive, but because it does require the district to incur additional costs to provide that water. I just wanted to add that comment to make sure the record was clear that our tiered rates, while they do provide a conservation incentive, they are designed to recover the district's actual costs of providing the additional water during peak periods.
Yeah, and actually, maybe to that point, when you come back to the board, you could reflect that, so we just kind of have a better understanding.
Correct.
I'm not sure how we do this, but as we look at water use, my fear is, and we're already doing it, we're drying up the country. And as we talked Friday at the Water Forum, we talked about we need more water, we need more storage, we need affordable water, and we're going completely in the opposite direction. So I don't know how maybe we can bifurcate at least a little bit of this, but regulatory and policy decisions of our other electeds at higher levels are driving us almost out of business. Because again, I know, Jim, what you're going to say, but there's an increased amount over and above what our normal, I'm going to call it normal operating increases have been over the years and going back into history, that is driving this at a much higher rate than I'm comfortable with, because this is a huge amount over 5 years, and then I don't see it getting any better.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Al.
It's very difficult to quantify all the regulatory costs associated with providing safe water, drinking water, and wastewater services, but I will share with you, it's every single year we get a new regulatory requirement. Now there's more reporting requirements on the water we're using, Now, there's a bill saying we can't augment potable water to recycled water after, I think it's 2028. So what type of capital do we have to invest to be able to make changes like this? But you're absolutely right. Every single year, the legislature tries to help us manage our business, and it's unfortunately, it adds a lot of costs.
We need that information out, and we can't say it enough because of what is driving the cost of this. Director Osborne?
We've done this exercise a couple of times, but potentially to mitigate the impact, could we do another analysis to see what if we would do a monthly billing in deference to 2 months billing? Because if you take 76% over 5 years and add that to a bill, it's, you know, maybe to mitigate it, it help the low-income person, or maybe there's an option, you get it every 2 months, or you get it every month, whatever, however we could do that. But I think we should look at it, at least look at the potential of billing monthly, because I can tell you, my water bill, I irrigate about acre and a half of yards and flowers and, you know, and my water bill is well over $300 in 2 months. Now, if I could cut that to $150 a month, I mean, I can afford it, but there's a lot of people that can't. And so just to look into it, okay?
Since I'm also trying to control costs, I don't want to hire additional staff to read meters every other month.
I want to know what the impact is.
But what we have offered, and I know Jenny's staff in customer services, if we get a call from a customer impacted by it and tell us that they're having difficulty paying, they set up payment programs. They'll say, pay half now, half next month. And we do it on an individual case-by-case basis. And if, I don't know if Jenny's listening in, she could
Jenny's not
probably
here.
add a lot of value to this, but we work with our customers, kind of like a informal balance payment plan, so that you may want to pay a little more in the winter, so you pay less in the summer, but we set it up on the
understand.
individual customer's
Yeah.
name.
I get questions from people saying, how come you don't go to 1 month billing instead of 2 months? And the answer is, it costs the district a whole lot of money to do 1 month billing, but I'd like to have the answer, okay?
Director Osborne, we actually brought this to the board recently.
Oh, I know.
So we can dust it off and provide it to the board in an email, or we can dust it off and present it. Okay, so we could dust it off and present it to the board again, but just as a reminder, we read meters every other month, so we would need additional staff to read meters every month.
I understand, but I
Okay.
need to know quantitatively to tell people, if we go to 1 month billing, this is what it's gonna cost in your rates to do it.
Okay, we could dust off the presentation that we presented recently and update it accordingly and bring that back to the board for the benefit of the public.
All right, Director Day.
Yeah, I was going to point out, that was something I had asked, and the staff came back, and we did the presentation. The conclusion was that, no, we don't want to read meters every month. That the expense of doing that and the time and extra staff, that's not worth doing. But averaging bills was an option, so that you don't read more often, but you just average it. Or the lowest cost option would be take that payment plan that we offer, but we need to promote it. We need to educate people about it and let them know that they can get a monthly bill and average it out over the course of the year, but we need to promote that. Not just wait for people when they're really desperate and hard up and call us.
Director Anzini.
I might have a different opinion of Director Dave, as somebody who's been in IT for a long time and billing and the process. So it might be difficult to calculate that. It might cost us more money in order to deal with a few people. I'm not countering it out, because I myself paid $300 this last month for my water bill, and I thought it was a broken valve. Probably was. It was going for 12 hours.
So that's not a decision before us.
But no,
Yeah,
it's
but-
not. So the
I don't want to get us
question,
too far off topic.
I know. But I think that the averaging part is a benefit to most people to give them the option is the education.
Right.
And we have to have staff to be able to handle that. If you change the billing, it costs us a whole lot more money.
All right,
I guess the point is if we can quantify what those costs are and tell people, you know, this is what it's gonna cost to do that, then it's a lot easier to explain it to people in difference to saying, why don't you just bill once a month?
potential options.
We'll bring it back to the board.
Okay, very good. All right, so do we have all of the input necessary, and we're going to go open to the public at this point? In the room, please, anybody wishing to comment on this item? Hey, Paul?
Hi, folks. Paul Penn, Diamond Springs. You got tough decisions. My approach to this has always been 4 priorities. Safe and reliable, 1 and 2. Inviable. Second, followed closely, affordable, sustainable. That's just my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody else in the room wishing to speak on the item? All right, Jen, how about online?
If members of the public would like to address the board on workshop item number 8, this is the time. There is no action on the item. It is information only. If you are participating via your phone, you just press *9 on your keypad, and that will raise your hand. And if you need to mute or unmute, that's *6. If you're participating through your computer, you can just hover down to the bottom of your screen. There's a raise your hand button. That will notify us on this side, and then we will allow you to speak. We just had once you called for public comment, we had several people drop off. So I'm assuming they just wanted to listen to the presentation and not make any comments. So I believe there are no members of the public online wishing to speak on on the workshop item number 8.
All right, I'd like to thank our consultants. Thank you, Jamie, as well. Thanks, everybody, for contributing to the dialogue. Very important decisions to come, but great information. All right, we will move on to item 9, action item.
Move 9.
Hold on for 1 second.
Yep, I do not have to recuse myself.
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. Any questions or discussion? Any public input? Anybody online?
President Verkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on action item number 9, option 1, moved by Director Osborne, second by Director Day. I believe we're ready for the vote.
Okay, please vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye. Motion carries unanimously.
Okay, we'll move on to item 10, engineering. Mr. Wilson, good morning.
Remember, he moved from engineering to operations.
Not with the agenda.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it was my fault.
There we go. Good to see you.
But you didn't correct it.
Pass the buck every chance I get.
Darn it.
Sorry, Mr. Wilson. Thanks for the correction.
I'm trying to figure out who to blame, and
I'm right here.
Blame me, I don't care.
it's Patrick's fault.
There you go. So proud.
It's still a good morning, Patrick.
Good morning.
There we go.
Good morning, Board. Patrick Wilson, Drinking Water Operations Manager, here to provide a contract amendment for the El Dorado Hills Water Treatment Plant Clearwell Pump Replacement Project. So, as the Board's aware, we've experienced some challenges at El Dorado Hills Water Treatment Plant so far this year. Obviously, clarifiers number 1 and 2 recently spoke about in the prior item. But in addition to that, we've experienced some other issues I'd like to discuss today. So what is a clear well? I'll start with that. So a clear well is the final line of defense for disinfection at the water treatment plants. Effectively, it's where the chlorine has enough time to disinfect the water prior to being distributed to customers. Clear well is imperative at every water treatment plant that we have, and this one in particular is a concrete clear well, and we do a formal inspection with in-house staff annually to kind of document the condition. Historically, this clear well has had a number of cracks to it, has required intermediate repairs up to this point. Fortunately, this year, no clear well crack inspection from the standpoint of the concrete. However, some other challenges were noted this year. 3 of the 9 pumps we found to be in significant deterioration from the prior year, requiring some repair as well as full replacement, which I'll get to in a moment. So some background. So we have 3 pumps. We effectively attack them in the order of the highest importance for the treatment process. So within the process, that clear well, as I mentioned, has a very limited span of operation in order to meet the contact requirements for disinfection. In fact, we're only allowed 18 inches of adjustment in that clear well during a standard summer plus or minus 14 million gallon a day operating. So that means that we have to utilize variable frequency drives in order to modulate that level, effectively an accelerator on your car. So pump 313, which is the pump that we made the first repair to, is actually one of the 2 VFD pumps. So we have 2 separate pressure zones within this system. We have one that's called 820, one that's a 960. Effectively, all you need to know is that's the actual elevation that water can serve. So 860 feet, or excuse me, 820 or 960 feet in elevation. All 3 of these pumps, unfortunately, are locked into the 960 zone. And that being said, it was an importance for us to get pump 313 repaired first, as it is the lead pump for the facility. That VFD...
Where primarily is the 960 zone?
Sure. So El Dorado Hills is kind of split up. We have the Oak Ridge tanks, as you might be familiar with. That's fed off the 960. That water can also reach, from that point, we'll either go to Valley View, across Highway 50 on the south side there, feeding both. It's called 835 down there and 960 as well. Longer conversation. Short version is it feeds the south side of 50. Subsequently, that water from Oak Ridge can also, all 960 water, can be pumped up to Ridgeview to feed that area. The 820 zone is a little bit different. That feeds Promontory, that feeds kind of the lower lying areas, Salmon Falls, that region as well, and out towards like Monte Vista, all the way out to the river and lake, excuse me.
Thank you.
Yep. So pump 313, we were able to get that pump repaired, and you'll see in a moment in the photos as to why. Pump 311, unfortunately, due to the corrosion that we had incurred in that period of time, we actually acquired a fracture in that pump bowl due to the corrosion. Therefore, the opportunity to make a repair to that pump wasn't really in the cards. So we were kind of forced into a full replacement pump to be ordered. That pump, due to the long lead time, will not be here until March of 2024. And the final pump that we were after this year is pump 312. We did find this pump to have non-standard parts. Effectively, the bearing journals had been machined years ago, and some tolerances had been adjusted to those motors. The motor that's attached to that pump. Because of those changes, it's really not an option to repair that pump. We are in need of a full replacement for pump 312 as well. Next slide. So just an overview. I know many of the board members have been to this site. This is the El Dorado Hills Water Treatment Plant. On the left-hand side, you can see the call for the pump station for the 960 and the 820 pumps. And to the left of that pump station, you see that rectangle. That's that concrete clear well that we're utilizing for disinfection purposes at the plant. Next slide. So here's an overview of the pump station, just a shot down the alley, if you will. And as you can note, the tolerances, this is a very tight pump station. In fact, there's no expanding of this facility left. Years ago, so in the 1960s, originally there were 2 pumps here, just giving you some background. Eventually in '93, when we did a plant upgrade to add some additional clarifying units, they actually constructed this pump station. With this pump station, they left some vacancies for future growth and expansion. The 960 and the 820 respectively, 1 pump for each of those was not installed in '93. Then in 2001, we added 2 additional clarifiers to the treatment plant process, which allowed us to add 2 additional pumps. We're at 19.5 MGD for that facility. That is full capacity at this pump station with no redundancy running at that full capacity. So effectively, in the event we're running in a summer demand period, all those pumps would be online in theory, depending on the zone that needs the water the most. I believe with all 6 of the pumps running in the 960 zone, we're right around 16.7 MGD of that 19. That would all be going mostly to Oak Ridge, obviously, to feed that distribution area. The point I'm trying to make with this slide is the very limited real estate that we have and the carefully constructed discharge header, which is all the way on the right-hand side against that wall, really limits us with the ability to select a separate pump than what's already been installed. So pump 313, as you can see on the left there, and then subsequently on the right, that's inside the clear well, that photo. And as you can see, there's some minor corrosion to that pump, but it's very limited. We noted this corrosion immediately, and that's the reason we moved forward with this pump. Its criticality ultimately is the real reason that we were really pushing to get this repaired. Thankfully, All Electric out of Auburn was able to make these repairs to this pump, and we were able to place it back in service.
Patrick, where's your knife?
Oh. I don't have that. Next time. Next slide, please. So pump 311, as you can see on the right-hand side, you can visibly see that crack. It's actually formed in 2 parts there on that pump. This pump, the minute this crack was found during the off-season, we have let me back up. So in the event that we're running a full 19.5 MGD, there is a potential that this pump will be online. However, on a day-to-day basis where we've been more on the lower side of demand, we've been able to actually move this pump out of rotation, so we're able to move it further down. And similarly with pump 312, we can effectively move that down in the pecking order, if you will, for when it gets called to actually pump to the system. We did that to try to prolong the life of this pump, especially considering that its full replacement will not be here until March of 2024. And so pump 312, as you can see, the corrosion is significantly worse. We had actually made repairs to this pump years ago, and obviously that's part of the tolerance issues that we found. This is also requiring a full replacement. Next slide. So the need for the contract amendment. So initially, pump 311, just to give you some background, we were able to do that under a repair contract. And then subsequently, we had to order a full replacement for pump 311. That pump was just over $63,704 plus tax and shipping. That was approved by the general manager. Today, the contract amendment will be for G3 Engineering for pump 312, which is $65,560 plus tax and shipping. Therefore, with a total contract which is greater than $100,000, necessitating board approval. Next slide. So the next steps, with the approval today, we'll procure pump 312. The anticipated delivery will be May of 2024. That'll allow us to get the pump installed prior to high demand again next summer. And we'll be able to install the replacement pumps when they do arrive.
How come it takes 9 months to get a pump?
Yeah, no kidding. A lot of it has to do with there's only one vendor in the western United States that, in California, that does this work, which is Flowway. Those are the pumps that the district selected back in the 90s, and we're kind of locked in with that because that discharge header, there's really a limited ability to make any modifications to that in order to meet demand. So we're really kind of stuck with one manufacturer, unfortunately, with that pump. So total project costs include, as I mentioned, the initial funding for pump 311 approved by the general manager, contract amendment for G3 Engineering for $68,560. We will also need crane services in order to install these pumps. As noted from that slide, it's very tight tolerances. We have a third-party company that comes in to help our staff to actually install those pumps. Very intricate work. It will require likely 2 separate installs because likely those pumps will be a month apart, and we'd like to get those done as quickly as possible. We do have some capitalized labor and the subtotal, including the additional funding request of $83,008. This funding is included in the board-approved 2023-2027 CIP. So initially, we have $600,000 for water treatment plant asset replacement. Even though that need has been growing, obviously, with the clarifiers, in addition to that, this funding will not put us over that $600,000, and I don't anticipate for the rest of this year to use the rest of that money. That's obviously subject to change given the aging infrastructure that we have at these plants. The project is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, as is a replacement of existing facilities, and if the project is approved, staff will file a notice of exemption from CEQA. And option one is to approve a contract amendment to G3 Engineering, Inc. in the not-to-exceed amount of $77,000 for the purchase of a Clearwell water pump at the El Dorado Hills Water Treatment Plant, and authorize additional funding of $3,000 for crane services and $3,000 in capitalized labor for a total funding request of $83,000 for the El Dorado Hills Water Treatment Plant Clearwell Pump Station Replacement Project, project number 23017.01, which staff has determined is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act. Option one. Any questions?
Move option one. Thank you, Patrick. Great presentation.
I'll second it.
We have a motion for option one with a second. Any further questions or discussion?
Second.
We already have it. Thanks, George.
Where's the guy from El Dorado Hills?
He was not quick on the draw.
You guys were faster than
Any comment of the public in the room? Anybody online, Jen?
President Verkamp, it does not appear any members of the public are wishing to speak on action item number 10, an operations item.
All right.
Option 1, which has been moved by Director Dwyer and seconded by Director Anzini. I believe we're ready for the vote.
Please vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 voting aye. Motion carries unanimously.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick. I don't know if that operations was a demotion or promotion, but anyway. Item 11, I'm not going to say which department, but Ms. Carrington,
Engineering, thank you.
engineering, there we go.
Alrighty, good morning, members of the board. Liz Carrington here, senior civil engineer here with the district. Today I'll be presenting two equipment procurement contracts for the emergency backup generator upgrades project. Thank you, Jim. Alrighty, next slide. Previous board actions, staff has been to the board a couple times. First, to provide an update that we have received hazard mitigation grant program funding. Also, the second time was in September of 2021 to award a contract to A-Team for the design and as well as additional funding for capitalized labor. Next slide. Summary of issues. The district received approval for over $3.5 million to date for hazard mitigation grant program funding for the emergency backup generators. Equipment procurement contracts are needed to purchase the generators in advance of the future construction project, just due to excessive lead times for the equipment. Next slide. All right. So originally in 2019, district staff applied for HMGP funding for 22 emergency backup generators. It was for 10 water pump station sites and 12 wastewater lift station sites. In 2021, FEMA and Cal OES notified the district of funding of $1.8 million of grant funding. Between 2019 and now, PG&E, the power safety shutdown program, the extents have been reduced, and also cost estimate, to your point, Director Osborne, have increased quite a bit. Alrighty, next slide. So during the design process, staff and the design team identified the need to modify the grant in 3 different ways. With the reduced extents of the PG&E Power Safety Shutdown Program, we found an opportunity to reduce the number of sites by 7. With every fixed generator, there are those fixed maintenance costs, and so if there's sites that have a reduced likelihood of power shutdowns, then it's well suited to do a trailer-mounted generator to be deployed if and when there is a power shutdown. Also, we saw the need to increase the grant funding from $1.8 million to $3.5 million. And also, the grant was awarded to the district around 2021 when we had Caldor Fire as well as the Motherlode Force Main break. And so engineering staff had to redirect our priorities to accommodate those emergencies that impacted the district. And after 9 months of working with Cal OES staff, we were able to achieve these three modifications with the grant. Alrighty. This slide is just to provide a map of the locations of the different stations. The blue is the water pump stations, the yellow is the wastewater lift stations. They're sprinkled all over EID's service area. Next slide. Alrighty. Request for bids. The solicitation was prepared by district staff before the amendment for the HMGP grant was granted to the district, and so originally we did include the 22 generators with the caveat that we would award a a contract for an undetermined amount of generators. And that, for one, gave us flexibility if we had to reduce down from 22 to 15 with the modified scope of work with the grant. But also we were able to look at the lowest bidder for each individual site, which is why we have 2 contracts today. Next slide. Alrighty. At this time, staff is working on construction documents for solicitation this fall. There's about a 30 to 50 week lead time for the generators. The current time extension is granted until September 18th of 2024, but future time extensions are available. They are subject to FEMA approval. Next slide. Funding. At this time, staff is only requesting funding for the contracts themselves. One for Bay City Electric, $678,465. Big Valley Electric, $263,000, for a total funding request today for $941,465. And I did want to note that this bid is consistent with the current engineer's estimate. Okay, next slide. Board options, option 1, award contracts to Bay City Electric in the not-to-exceed amount of $678,465. And Big Valley Electric in the not-to-exceed amount of $263,000 for purchase of 15 emergency backup generators for a total funding request of $465 for the emergency backup generator upgrades project, project number 21040.01 and 21041.01. Next slide. Board options, take other options. The recommendation for staff is option 1.
I'll make a motion.
All right, Director Anzini,
I'll make a motion to approve this, but I need some questions answered.
do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thanks, Director Ryer. Okay.
Yeah, so going back to the generators, the FEMA grant, this is all money that we've received from FEMA, right?
FEMA has allocated funding to us, and then staff develops a quarterly reimbursement request and quarterly update report. And so as we incur those costs, we are reimbursed.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is not out of our own budget because we applied for the FEMA grants because of the Caldor fire, or isn't this all part of that?
So this is hazard mitigation grant program funding. And so the way FEMA looks at it is, so the monies from Caldor is a public assistance grant.
Right.
That is damages to the district, and then we're seeking reimbursement because that disaster happened. Hazard mitigation is a program to look forward to say, okay, there's hazards for the district and all other areas in California and the country, and how can we mitigate those hazards moving forward? And so this is not quite related to wildfire. This is more mitigating the damages from lost water revenue or the inability to pump water to our customers and the inability to operate our lift stations to convey wastewater. So this is mitigating that risk.
Okay.
But it's a 25% match, correct?
So yes, the total
Thank you.
project estimate is $4.6 million, and so we're requesting FEMA to cover 75% of the total project cost.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any public input? Oh, yes, I'm sorry, Director Day.
Yeah, where do we stand? We've been adding a lot of backup generators, which is all to the good. But where do we stand when this is completed next year sometime, hopefully? Where will we stand on, are there any gaps or areas remaining that still need backup generators?
I'll defer to Dan on that one.
Morning, Dan.
Good morning. Dan Corcoran, Operations Director. So we have we're continuing to grow, over 170 PG&E electrical service connections now. So we have over 100 large generators that we do place throughout the district. Are there gaps? Yes. I'd like to put them at every location, but there becomes a practical sense of the financial viability, as Liz was describing. The other part that's really important for the board to understand is when PG&E implemented its EPSS, the most recent program, Electrical Power Line Safety Settings Program, that's the quick disconnect. That's when we reevaluated in light of the project costs and made that adjustment from 22 to 15. So to answer your question in a short way, we've hit the highest priority that have the greatest impact in terms of staff's ability to mobilize both for the drinking water system for pump stations as well as on the wastewater system for sewer lift stations. Our ability to get out there, mitigate, depends on what size storage is there, what size of the wet well. So we've hit the highest priority with this batch. So.
So it sounds like with PG&E's reoperation on their emergency shutoffs, they're doing more frequent, shorter shutoffs, but not as many of the long 1, 2, 3 day type
I
shutoffs.
think that's a fair summary of what we've seen with implementation last year was the full-scale EPSS. So it's nice in that the impacts are shorter, but the challenge is we don't have advance notice. So it requires immediate response. So if they sense any short in the line, unfortunately, a lot of times it's in the middle of the night on the weekend, then staff are running out to do that. So whereas historically, when we first set up in 2018 with the PSPS program, we had 48 to 72 hours to go out, deploy resources in advance. So our tactics have had to change in response to PG&E changing their tactics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
I think if I could just take 1 second, I want to make sure we recognize Liz's accomplishment. She just, in light of, she glossed over it because she's very modest, but that the recent change that we received from FEMA, we were just awarded another $1.7 million for this project alone, thanks to her efforts. So $3.5 million towards this. So I just wanted to recognize her achievement. So.
Very good. Thank you, Liz, for that. Thanks, Dan. All right, do we have any comment from the public? Nobody in the room. Jen, anybody online?
President Camp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on action item number 11, option 1, moved by Director Anzini and seconded by Director Dwyer. I believe we're ready for the vote.
Okay, please vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
All right, thank you very much, Liz. A review of assignments? Anything, Jen, you want to reiterate?
We have some direction to staff being, as updates to the cost of service, study analysis. And so we'll be bringing those forward at a future meeting.
Okay. I believe then we are adjourned.